A hiring process is conventionally accompanied by a job description. There's the usual listing of responsibilities, but on occasion, the aspiration is that the hiree will not only master that list, but will bring with him a job reimagining that transcends the stated requirements. The position of Director of New York Museum of Modern Art demands such a reimagining. Barry Bergdoll directs an institution self-designated as modern. Barry's project is the modern exegesis. Is that job a singular or a plural? Andre Malraux, a consultant on Museums Without Walls, advised Barry as follows: man can rest from the disdainful splendor of the nebulae, the music of the spheres, and broadcast it across the years to come, bestowing on them messages as yet unknown. So how does Mr. Bergdoll bestow on us those messages as yet unknown? The director can designate the modern as a moment delimited in time. He can demonstrate that within that temporal bracketing, an authoritative list of practitioners produced a body of work premised on a particular discourse, then ratify that premise with examples of the resultant architecture. And in this rendition, the modern becomes simply a stop on an ongoing historian's journey. Alternatively, the director can suggest that the modern thesis is not time-bound at all, but is instead an ongoing prospect, not a fixed moment or a designated body of work, but an aspiration to uncover what new architecture might make the world other than it is. The modern forever hypothesis implies that the world of architecture is a perpetual moment of becoming. Or perhaps the modern is both a time-designated history and simultaneously an uncovering of efforts toward an as yet indeterminate future. In this version, modern becomes the tension between historic and as yet to be historic moderns. Then there's the John Milton option. The architect's reach should exceed the architect's grasp, or what's the future for? According to architect Milton's sensibility, forever modern constitutes a commitment to change without requiring that that change ever arrive at a state of resolution. So which modern is the modern? One of Barry's curatorial predecessors, Ezra Pound, contributed significantly to the What's Modern discourse when in 1928, Pound told the tale of the Chinese Emperor Tang, who in the 18th century BC had his morning wash basin inscribed with the admonition, "Each day, make it new." Pound then posted that Chinese admonition on the intellectual barricades of modernism, insisting it was his followers' responsibility to continue to make it new. Ironically, we now know that the Chinese phrase Pound absconded with can equally be translated as "do it again," an admonition to redundancy. So was the East advising the West to make it new or to make it over? At the time Pound posted his Make It New notice, another group of Barry's curatorial predecessors, Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson, launched the authorized rendition of American modernism as both text and exhibit. Barry's institution traces its discursive origins to that international style pedigree. But was the exhibition a genuine precursor for the modern, or did Hitchcock and Johnson's rendition jettison key intellectual components over the Atlantic and leave America with a disingenuous pedigree? Philip presented the modern as a rule system, not a fragile exploratory state, but rather a mandated set of designer criteria. Want to be a modern architect? Just reference the International Styles Appendix and follow the instructions. That codification of criteria made the modern a method, a fixed system, an idiom to teach, to learn, and to replicate. Meanwhile, House Beautiful, a Hearst publication in the 1950s, railing against modern architecture, added another plausible credential to the repertoire. Modern architecture as subversive, on the attack against the traditional form language of American architecture and American conservative values. Two ways of life stretch before us, says the 1953 editorial. One leads to the richness of variety, to comfort and beauty. The other, the one we want fully to expose to you, retreats to poverty and unlivability. Worst of all, it contains a threat of cultural dictatorship. Is that 1950s subverter of the American way synonymous with the contemporary idiom we locate more than half a century later on the covers of Dwell magazine? So what's the modern's job description? Please welcome Barry Bergdoll to SCI-Arc.
I want to give thank you very much, Eric. I want to give a different lecture now and somehow to respond to that poetic provocation. When I received the invitation to come, I hesitated for a long time about what to present of my current work, which really intersects my training as an architectural historian and my daytime job teaching architectural history at Columbia with the last 7 years in which I have indeed been at the helm of the oldest department of architecture, later architecture and design, in a museum of modern art anywhere in the world, and where curating has become part of my means of expression, I suppose, one of my, along with texts and lectures, curating exhibitions, working through space. I decided in the end to bring you a very historical lecture taken from a 6-part lecture series that I gave last year at the National Gallery of Art on the origins and modernity, there's actually a typo here, the origins and modernity of exhibiting architecture. I want to take you back in time to a moment that thought of itself as modern, perhaps part of this genealogy and set of paradoxes that Eric Owen Moss has just elaborated, and then bring you forward to the moment around 1932 when this department that was referred to and where I work was founded, and then just very briefly reference some of the work that I've done as a curator there in my own effort perhaps to work alongside you, which I think actually happens in this school, trying to come up with messages of what is yet unknown. So I'm going to take you first on a little tour of the world with me, and then back in my historian's work to a kind of archaeology of the architectural exhibition as a kind of ongoing experiment in exploring indeed the modernity of architecture. This is actually where I work, and this is a photograph of 1953, so quite appropriate to the opening. This is the site of the end of the Museum of Modern Art garden and the house in the garden of 1953, the last of the series of houses, the successor to Breuer and to get Gregory Ain. But I start biographically on the task of balancing the life of a historian with that of a curator. 3 years ago, as I began the daunting task of preparing the Mellon Lectures, a 6-part series before a public audience, not simply an audience of students or professionals in architecture, it was hard to find the time to pursue in great depth the topic that I'd given myself, the history of exhibiting architecture, simply because I was overwhelmed not only by my duties at the museum, which run the full array, this is the exhibition
that we opened 3 days ago, Frank Lloyd Wright's Ambivalent Attitudes Towards the City, an exhibition called Frank Lloyd Wright and the City, Dispersal versus Density, which is about a central tension in Wright's work. Last year's historical exhibition on Henri Labrousse, which also coincided with the debate on library space at the New York Public Library, and then 2 of last year's Young Architects programs, which also remind us, and one is reminded as you enter this building, that architectural exhibitions also produce ephemeral structures at one-to-one scale and transform spaces of the everyday. Sometimes, as in your own campus, they are so beloved that the ephemeral takes on an aspect of the permanent, kind of dinosaurs from earlier experiments that are left around to challenge. This is a snapshot of one season. And it is not meant simply to be a kind of airplane agenda, but it is to set the stage for what interests me historically. As I go back to look at where did the frenetics of today, in which it is almost impossible to keep up with the world, not so much of building, but of exhibiting building or ideas about building, has reached a pitch that I think was hardly imaginable even as recently as 1932, when a Department of Architecture was proposed and finally accepted somewhat reluctantly by the trustees of the Museum of Modern Art. This is, therefore, a portrait of the autumn-winter of 2010-11. Not only did we open at MoMA 3 architectural exhibitions radically different from one another, and this, too, I think is interesting to observe in beginning. If I were to show you 3 art exhibitions from MoMA, the work on display would look very different, but the exhibitions might look relatively recognizable one to another. This is an exhibition of work from the permanent collection called Building Collections, which was about explaining the logic and strategies of collecting architecture in a museum of art. The trustees of MoMA had in fact originally refused a Department of Architecture by saying you can't collect it, so what would a department do? But at the same time we had on exhibition this show called Counterspace, Design and the Modern Kitchen, which featured at its heart probably one of the largest acquisitions, at least in size, if not in number of objects during my tenure at the museum, a complete original Frankfurt kitchen, one of these famous rationalized, partly prefabricated kitchens from the Frankfurt housing program of the 1920s. You see it here on the left, and as installed on the right. Fascinatingly authentic object, which I'm sure any surviving Frankfurt resident of the 1920s would scarcely recognize in its new museum environment. And at the same time, small-scale big change, new architectures of social engagement, an advocacy exhibition, and I want to end on the notion of advocacy as we go over this historical panorama, an exhibition about the activist role many architects are taking in underprivileged environments around the world. But more important than that advertising moment for what goes on and has gone on recently at MoMA, in addition to those installations, the hectic pace of the winter of 2010-11 was set by the world of architectural exhibitions in general. Even my own unquenchable thirst for travel was not able to keep up with the international events where one would expect to see the Philip Johnson Chief Curator of Architecture of the Museum of Modern Art, worldwide architectural biennials, triennials, and of course even a World's Fair. Since I've written this, I think about 3 more biennials have been invented. And of course, indeed, that year, even a World's Fair, the latest day incarnation of one of the great genres of architectural exhibition. The 2010 Shanghai World's Fair, visited by over 1.2 million people a day. Even Glenn Lowry has not achieved these statistics. During its final week, I show you a newspaper that I collected on my way in. That punctuated for me the midpoint of a fall that was dominated also by the 12th Venice Architectural Biennale. And here, this I have to show you. This is from the Shanghai Biennial. This is the Dutch Pavilion, which was absolutely brilliant. It took the form of the recently completed freeway system of Shanghai and converted it into the ramps for history of housing in the Netherlands exhibition. But equally during that time, my travel that took me only to a fragment of the worldwide spectacle of architectural exhibitions. The 12th Venice Architectural Biennale, no slides. Here, the 22nd Architectural Biennial on the left of the Society of Architects of Colombia, that held that year in Medellin to coincide with another biennial, the 7th Iberia-American Architectural Biennial, a rare case in which two biennials actually encounter one another. The World Architectural Festival in Barcelona, and on the right-hand screen, the Architecture Triennale in Lisbon, one back, with its series of exhibitions, of which I'm showing you here, a fascinating one showing the results of a competition for a house in Luanda, in Angola, on display in an extraordinary institution, the Lisbon Electricity Museum. And it occurred to me that perhaps if architecture is very difficult to exhibit, and we're going to talk a bit about that, perhaps electricity is even more difficult to exhibit. Although recently, because we're launching the Young Architects program now also in Seoul, in South Korea, I encountered the Museum of Taxation in South Korea. Like the others on the street, I was afraid to go in for fear of what might transpire there, so I still do not know the answer to how you exhibit taxes. So there are things actually that are more paradoxical to exhibit indeed than architecture. Oh, my slide series is not completed. I still haven't finished labeling these digital images from two Sao Paulo architectural biennials. This is the last time before it was kicked out of the Niemeyer building, and here a pavilion in a pavilion by Ben van Berkel, or for that matter, the Gwangju Architecture and Design Biennial of South Korea, as well as the recent Hong Kong and Shenzhen Architectural Biennial in China, now in its second edition and still not labeled. Not to mention the year before, the opening of a new Museum of Architecture here on the screen, the Cité de l'Architecture in Paris, an architecture museum in preparation for over 3 decades, in which time other institutions beat them to it, notably the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, the German Architecture Museum on the right in Frankfurt, and the new Galleries of Architecture at the V&A in London, to name a few. I could go on to talk about the upcoming architectural biennials in Istanbul, Vienna, and Venice, where Rem Koolhaas is promising to shake up that now 35-year-old institution. But I think my breathless and boring point is clear. In the past few years, the spectacle of architecture is everywhere, even if the press is still filled with the discussion of the eclipse of starchitects. Although with Koolhaas's appointment, one might wonder about our current period of star curators. In a period where curators often seem as famous as contemporary artists and architects, in which curators' names appear for the first time in recent decade, in the last decade on the walls of shows they have curated, and in which the word curate has been applied to everything from meals to clothes. Exhibition culture has taken on a life of its own, often quite independent of the world of architectural practice in the everyday sphere. But what does it mean to exhibit architecture? Isn't architecture, once it is built, always already on display, even without going to the extremes? Here we are in Buenos Aires, and I'm going to take you on a boat trip to the region of the Tigre, even if we didn't go to the extremes of here, of putting architecture in a display case, as is the case of the glass box over the national Argentinian monument, the house of Domenico Faustino Sarmiento, the great Argentine hero and 7th president of the country in the mid-19th century. His house visited by some 50,000 people a weekend in summer. It's been a listed and protected building since 1966, but since 1996, it has been also an object in a museum vitrine. And if we feel that buildings needed a curatorial voice and not simply an authorial voice, in other words, not simply an architectural voice, perhaps we could take to issuing buildings with wall text and labels, the most common apparatus and the most contentious apparatus of the exhibition. As, for instance, has been done here, in this recently completed cultural center. This is the last, in fact, posthumous work of the great Colombian architect, kind of rebellious disciple of Le Corbusier, Rogelio Salmona, the Casa de la Cultura de Moravia, in a very poor neighborhood of Medellin, a little bit off the beaten track from where all of the architecture tourists go to see the work, for instance, of Giancarlo Mazzanti or the tramway. The interesting thing here is that in this poor neighborhood, and this is a place with a small library and a cultural center, every aspect of the building is explained in great detail. Here's the plaque with the name of the architect and the commissioner, and then we go into a series of indoor-outdoor spaces, a kind of veritable lexicon of the late Salmona. But for instance, here in this patio, we have a text about mirrors of water, explaining that Salmona is interested in tradition and what traditions there are that might be evoked here. So a very didactic voice. Or here, ramps, inviting us to enjoy time, as my colleague here from Architectural Record is in taking her photograph and stopping on the ramp right there. Or as we move on, each aspect of the building explained. Now, to a certain extent, this project is not new. Already in the 18th century, of course, Horace Walpole had a guidebook to Strawberry Hill, one of the earliest of quite a number of antiquarian houses in which dwelling and display already merged. And plaques and texts have long ago converted our cities into open-air museums, but perhaps with less didactic insistence than in the case in Colombia that I just showed you. Now, as is well known, it is notoriously difficult to bring architecture into the space of the gallery. And we could have a discussion about your gallery that I just managed to have a view of a moment ago with its objects, unsure whether we're looking at one-to-one scale objects or representations of something not there. But in most cases, historically, the gallery has been the site of representations of architecture, and it's really only in very recent years that the creation of architecture inside the gallery space has become a genre, but more on that later. For centuries, works of painting, sculpture, and other two-dimensional arts have found their home and the possibility for both exhibition and curatorship in the gallery, and architecture generally came along on their coattails. And of course, nearly every lecture, and you're already probably closing your notebook, you've heard some version of this, every lecture on the Architectural Museum or the Architectural Exhibition begins by rehearsing the truism that architecture can only be exhibited through simulacra, substitute objects, or representations. Originally drawings, models, or mock-ups, or prints, illustrated books, and other images after the building either already completed or projected. Later photographs, films, and of course computer simulations would join that arsenal of means of representing the art of architecture in a place other than where it was standing to be seen in situ. The architectural exhibition then is, with very few exceptions, almost always a radical deracination of architecture. Simulacra and deracination, the architectural display starts then from a lack. Some might even say, in the case of fragments, the building blocks of many early architecture museums, born of an act of destruction or violence, and from something that for many is a poor reflection of the monumental grandeur and placemaking of the art of architecture, at least traditionally. So as I began to think, how could I craft a lecture series last year around this topic of its history, I began to ask myself, what would it mean to all of that seemed incredibly boring. I thought that's what one always says, take that kind of negative statement and make it into a history of representation. This has already been done. The opening exhibition of the Canadian Centre for Architecture was, in fact, a history of representation. But what I asked myself, would it mean to craft a history, not of the poor substitute that is an exhibition condemned to work with placebos, but rather a history of the potentialities of the architectural exhibition? And I think that that's probably the only thing that could explain the fact that 250 years after exhibitions began, I'm going to try to demonstrate those origins to you now briefly, the architectural exhibition has taken on such a worldwide rhythm of innovation and frequency. It seemed to me the only then to ask, why was it that the habit of exhibiting architecture in the gallery first became common practice during the Enlightenment in London in the 1760s, soon after in Paris, and then in Berlin, St. Petersburg, and nearly every European city, major or second tier, in which there was an academy by the end of the 18th century, even if we can find isolated and quite specific cases a half-century earlier, notably in Papal Rome. And to ask the question then, to what extent did the phenomena of displaying architecture change the very nature and possibilities of architecture? So with my series title, Out of Sight, S-I-T-E, In Plain View, I propose that the part of the very essence of a self-consciously modern architecture is wrapped up in the ability to put architecture on display, to take it out of its original site, to return it to plain view, and that in fact the exhibition has been a vital instrument to some of the greatest features of modern architecture since the Enlightenment. The emergence of a critical discourse on the public character and responsibilities of architecture, the invention of a history of architecture with its consequences for the exploration of architectural meaning and its capacities to build, in the 19th century, national, regional, and local identities, and indeed the capacity of architecture to project entirely new programs. This goes back to Eric's idea of the messages of the yet unknown, to which we'll turn a little bit later in this presentation. But that third capacity of architecture to project entirely new programs and environments that we associate with the very condition of the avant-garde. So my argument in short is that at nearly every step of architecture's modern history, and indeed of the history of architecture as modern, exhibitions have been an integral part of the life of architecture, an enabler as much as a reflection. The possibility of exhibiting architecture out of sight, but in plain view, is essential to creating a modern discourse on architecture, not only in terms of public discernment, but also about the values of projects for urbanism, for the public good, and the like. Now here, the key decade is the 1760s, it seems to me. I bet these types of images are not projected in this room all that frequently, but you're going to see that they're very much related to this problem of can you bring the architecture into the space of the gallery, and most importantly for me, can you acquire and build an audience for architecture outside the profession itself. Now, it is true that exhibitions of architectural drawings were part of school training, the academic training of emerging professionals, almost from the earliest Italian academies in the 16th century. And with the rise of the academic competition system, which of course gives rise in essence to the corridor of this building in which pin-ups take place, with the rise of the academic competition, first with the concorsi clementini, the Clementine competitions at the Academy of St. Luke in Rome from the very late 17th century, and here's one of the great products of that, this beautiful drawing by Uvara. The practice arose of pinning up drawings on the wall for a jury to compare. The student projects unsigned, and we're in France in the late 19th century, fully 200 years later, the student projects unsigned were numbered, and only at the Academy in Rome did the secretary have a corresponding list of the names, a practice which may have already been in use in the occasional competition from the Renaissance on to decide building commissions of great import. Now, beginning in 1695 in Rome, the winning projects were exhibited to the public for a week, along with the names of their winners, and then kept in a great cabinet in the Academy as study materials. And already as early as 1708, a Parisian student had proposed, when asked to design an academy, a gallery for exhibiting architecture. But this does not seem to have been put in practice in France until well over a century later, when more and more sophisticated pin-ups of the drawings were created for the exclusive use of judges, even though as early as 1758, that great teacher, Jacques-François Blondel, teacher of a whole generation, both in the academy and in a private school, there's a kind of forerunner to SCI-Arc that way. Here's somebody who had a kind of official position and started a radical school, called for a gallery for exhibiting architectural drawings within any school. But it is not this per se that is the subject of my history. For no doubt in architecture studios for centuries, drawings had been pinned to the wall and discussed among equals and between masters and apprentices. Something changes in the mid-18th century, and I want to turn to that. You've probably seen these drawings. They're exhibited over and over again. They're among the only, they're actually prints, that represent the daily life of architecture students at the École des Beaux-Arts. You probably actually use a word that's derived from the one on the left. These are the students having completed their drawings at the very last minute, rushing them to register them with the registrar on the right in a little cart known as a charrette, a little cart, so that the rush to finish something comes from this idea of the charrette. And here they are exhibited in the École des Beaux-Arts, the kind of origins of the American pin-up and studio tradition, with one vital difference, and perhaps why the French academic tradition was so deadly as compared to its American variant, you'll notice in the top that there's not a single student present. So the drawings were pinned up, discussed by the professors, a prize was given, and a list of reasons for that prize or for the lack of the prize was handed to the student, but no discussion took place between students and professors. That's one of the leading innovations of American architectural education over the last century. So let's just then take up what to me is absolutely key, and this is what changes in the mid-18th century. This is not simply the admission of the public in Rome, and it seems also in Madrid, to witness the role the academic competition played in establishing the credentials of an emerging architect, the credentials being the ability to project a complex building design independent of a building site or even of a real commission. But rather what changes that's vital is the public reception and debate of architectural projects, not only as works of art, but as issues of public concern. Before the mid-18th century, there are isolated examples of displays related to competitions, notably for the baptistry doors in Florence in the Renaissance, and in 1790 here, in a well-documented case when the Jesuits, almost unwittingly, were forced into allowing the choice of an architect and a design for the chapel that you see on the left here, the chapel of St. Ignatius in the south transept of the great church of the Gesù, the Jesuits' main church in Rome, and they had recourse to a public display of designs for how to outfit and transform the shallow space of that transept in an up-to-date style. But this did not happen, it seems, willingly. It's a display, unfortunately, of which we have no visual record, but which is documented on the right, in a careful recording of all of the comments overheard in the display. So it's a curator's dream, a kind of tape recorder or nightmare in the gallery capturing what is heard. I did actually once follow the visitors around in an exhibition I did on the challenge of rising sea levels called Rising Currents, and I had two visitors leaving, one turned to the other and said of the exhibition, which clearly she found very, very dense, she said, "It's an awful lot to absorb." And so I couldn't help but say in loud breath, "I think you got the main point." Already at the time, it was noted that once word spread of this commission, that the display was underway in Rome of the competitive designs for this altarpiece, quote, "It is unbelievable how many ran from every part of the city to see it, stimulated by curiosity, which had been aroused by the shrill tones of earlier that had already spread word around the city. Innumerable cardinals, bishops, prelates, princes, gentlemen, architects." It's a wonderful hierarchical order here. "Gentlemen, architects, painters, priests, monks, and laymen of every sort came. There was in some a continuous flow of people, almost a fleet at sea." So clearly the first architectural exhibition that I've found was incredibly popular. This is rarely the case in the rest of my history. But as art historian Ivan Levy demonstrates, the Jesuits' concern was to manage gossip and to use the display as a mechanism of propaganda, not to seek discordant opinions or to foster public debate. On the contrary, and it is this that I would argue, following, of course, in the classic analysis of the interaction between the press and the coffee house by Jürgen Habermas in his influential and controversial 1962, The Structural Change of the Public Sphere, it is this that marks the gradual entry of architecture into the public exhibition in London and Paris in the mid-18th century, just as both cities began extraordinary periods of urban change. In 1760, in the free market of London, was created the Society of Artists, the first of a series of venues where within a few years, architects would freely exhibit their works without being enrolled pupils or admitted members of any academy. At first, these were largely prints, like the one you see on the left, that were for sale, or individual images that were destined for bound books. We might say that the illustrated book was, in a certain sense, the first traveling exhibition. But soon other types of projects began to find their way onto display, and thus into the columns of the new public handbills and magazines. And the exhibition quickly changed from being an advertisement for a multiple that could be purchased to making claims for architecture as an art form and for its stake in public debate. Much research remains to be done on the development in Britain, where a free market reigned, and where it would seem, at a cursory look at the catalogs of these exhibitions, and these are very hard to come by, that lesser-known architects were primarily attracted to this possibility to make a name. So when you get a hold of the first catalogs, you've almost never heard, or the history of architecture has almost never heard, of the person on display. That too is going to change rather rapidly. Leading early exhibitors include the otherwise on the left little-known Matthias Darley, who exhibited architectural designs regularly at the Society of Arts from 1765 to 1771, although he is primarily remembered, if at all, as an engraver of architectural ornament. And indeed, the earliest use, therefore, seems to have been to promote sales, first of the prints themselves, later of services as an architect. Charles Cameron, for instance, here on the screen, was to make his name with designs for Catherine the Great in Russia. And when he had, like, the plum patron of all times, the Empress of Russia, he still sent back regularly drawings to London, exhibiting examples of his work in 1767 at the Free Society, and then again in 1772 at the Society of the Arts. Something that I think could be interpreted as maybe an anxious notion that if he were going to return home, he should send regular newscasts and maintain his reputation far away from the adopted country, an appeal perhaps for other clients. But by the end of the century, we see the emergence of something that's generally been thought of as a 20th century or late 19th century phenomena, the exhibition artist-architect. By the end of the century, John Soane, a brick builder's son, had risen to fame not only through architecture, but through exhibiting architecture, through regular exhibition at the Royal Academy. And he would give, throughout the 1790s, almost annual updates on the progress of one of the great buildings of the period, the extraordinary vaulted spaces of the Bank of England. Now, this is, this is fascinating in many regards. Soane is one of the first architects that we know of to maintain on kind of retainer a professional renderer, Joseph Gandy. So these are actually not drawings by Soane that are on display. They're almost always Soane being exhibited through the painterly vision of this kind of English Piranesi, Gandy. And Gandy, like Piranesi too, is a rare architect, but increasingly more common in the late 18th century, who primarily works through the imaging and the projection of architecture with very, very little building to their names. Even more fascinating is, of course, this is a building of great public prominence on the street, but one to which no one had full access to any more than a small fragment of the incredible spaces of this famous bank. Even if you were doing banking activities, you might have access to one or two of these rooms, but never free access to this entirely set of picturesque sequences, experimental vaulting techniques, and some of the most astounding spatial experiments of the period. And I think it's this that explains this very late drawing submitted to the project, not, as has sometimes been claimed, a view of the Bank of England in ruins, which would scarcely serve the needs of that financial institution, but rather of it under construction, so that a bird's eye view of these spaces could at least be brought into the space of the gallery. Now, architects were limited to one drawing per project in the Academy exhibitions in London, and therefore we begin to see Soane emerging with these types of omnibus illustrations where he's trying to bend the rules all the way throughout, creating completely new ways of representing architecture that will have an enormous effect on the practice of architecture, particularly in Britain for the next 50 years. Now let's look at Paris briefly in completing our search for the origins of the architectural exhibition. The French Academy created a very, very different situation. In the same years that we were just looking at in London, in Paris, the artist who pioneered the exhibition as a form of self-promotion, Charles de Vailly, opened with his first act, the creation of a personal stand, a kind of very first monograph perhaps, at the edge of the salon, held biannually since 1737 in these spaces here on the screen in the Louvre. There, hidden behind a curtain, de Vailly listened to the thought of the visitors, although he would admit that they were never as numerous as those who gathered before the most spectacular new history paintings. So it's kind of Wizard of Oz of the architectural exhibition, if you will. He knew that this was an informed public that entered the biennial, the Salon, and it was also a very hard time for architects and for public commissions. Many architects were in want of tasks. It was necessary to scheme to get attention. When de Vailly, in 1771, exhibited this painting, his project for the Chateau de Moussa, one of the most radical house designs of the period. It was an unprecedented act made possible by the fact that the Marquis de Marigny, the director of the King's Buildings, had promoted de Vailly directly to the first class of the Academy of Painting, a rare case of an architect who was a member of both the Architecture and Painting Academies. Now, only members of the Royal Academy of Painting had the right to exhibit. And so we find that the earliest architects who display as painters. Charles-Louis Clarisseau is the first architect ever admitted to the Painting Academy, 1769, took advantage sometimes to show off his prowess with visions of antiquity or caprices. And we know that he did this not only in Paris, but when he moved to London in the 1770s, exhibiting regularly there. And interestingly, we even have the critiques in the press of Clarisseau's of drawings, as well as a copy of one of the catalogs that includes the remarks by Horace Walpole, who noted that he disliked Clarisseau's exhibitions because they looked like stage sets and therefore threatened to render architecture into a simple form of operatic production. But de Vailly was the first to exhibit his own, we go back here, his own architectural design. And more importantly, even is the only one to have exhibited his own work underway. So to have understood the architectural exhibition or the potentialities of this kind of wedge to create an exhibiting of architecture as a possibility of exhibiting the not yet known, of showing a future of a project and therefore changing the possibilities of architecture to come rather than simply recording architecture that already was. Most important here then is this promotion of a building not yet designed, peopled often with future or imaginary users who could take on many of the same rhetorical gestures and functions of figures in history painting, and therefore were the types of personages that the audience was already learned in reading. This then became a valuable instrument in the emerging public discourse on contemporary issues of architecture and urbanism, on the crafting of the public realm, something more famously associated with the first works of written architectural criticism by Voltaire and by the Fond de Saint-Étienne, who's often called the first art critic in the world, when both began publishing pamphlets urging the king, King Louis XV, to take up incomplete and essential tasks, to complete the Louvre Palace and clear up the debris in front and to render it a monument worthy of Paris, and to use it as an agent for creating new forms of public space around monuments. Voltaire famously quipping that Paris didn't need to build anything to become the greatest city in the world. It merely needed to place exhibitions of space, as it were, around monuments to free them up and to create conditions for viewing. A few years later, when the competition for entries for the Place Louis XV, a square around a recently completed equestrian monument of the king, gave rise to a competition on what form and what site in the city should the square take. The architect Pierre Pat exhibited them in a kind of exhibition on a plate of all of the competition proposals, as though the competition proposed to build 27 of them rather than one, and Paris was transformed into a map of a Paris that could be. De Vailly's piece that was submitted to acknowledge what's called the reception piece, his admission to the Academy of Painting, was in turn exhibited to the public here, you see it on the screen, in the Salon of 1771. And it was in fact a depiction of the future vestibule and staircase. It was actually this drawing along with the lower one here. The future vestibule and staircase of the projected theater of the Odéon, inviting the public in already not only to partake of the theater as a place of public assembly, a forum for modernity in this northern city, that was in some ways for him a recreation of the Forum of the Ancients, replete with a cast of theatergoers straight from the world of history painting. So it's fascinating in these views, these are daily Parisian dress, but inside everybody has gotten into antique costume as though they're about to perform not only an antique public ritual of being together in public space, but perhaps a play by Racine or one of the great classical writers of the period. Now, de Vailly was not alone in exhibiting architectural images at the Salon. Ruin painters we've already seen, like Hubert Robert and Pierre de Machy, created even a critical discourse on the notion of the view of the ruin. But de Vailly was the first to take up what you see here on the screen, the painter de Machy's radical gesture of exposing a representation of a future project into the space of the gallery and the salon, where a lively critical discourse had emerged. Now, I'm referring, of course, to one of the most spectacular architectural exhibitions of the 18th century. And this was when de Machy, on the orders of the architect Soufflot, on the site that had just been cleared for the first freestanding monumental church of the 18th century, erected a painting at 1-to-1 scale of this classical portico. You can see what a change it represents to the city of Paris, as well as creating bleachers for building it that represented the semicircles of the half-round square that he wanted to create. So the laying out of a kind of temporary situation for the future, take another 40 years for this to come into being. It was such a stunning event that de Vailly then painted a painting of the painting and exhibited that painting at the Salon, and very much commented on in the press at the time. Now, like all the techniques of display that I developed in this lecture series and this future history that I'm writing of architectural exhibitions, once a technique, we might call it a technology of display, emerges, it's not sort of transcended by the next. We could say that the history of architectural exhibitions, and why I think it's so vital to go back to the 18th century, is that the emergence of each technique is cumulative, a kind of ever-enlarging palette, so that what we've just seen with de Machy is very, very frequent today, continuing to have later-day applications. Today, as buildings are restored, any of you travel in Italy know this, any of you who follow the product line of Benetton in particular, when buildings are under restoration, usually a full-scale photograph now appears representing them, coupled with advertisement. Perhaps the most potent current use is in the politics over the rebuilding of the center of the former capital of East Germany, now the capital of United Germany. Here for nearly a decade now, this is not a real building, but in fact a digital rendering of an engraving by Schinkel. Here for nearly a decade now, a simulacrum of Schinkel's demolished architecture school has stood as a full-scale scaffold to defend the positions of those, in my view, ultra-conservative architects in Berlin who seek a literal recreation of the lost monuments of the Prussian capital, a display that seems blissfully ignorant of the complexities of the shards of history everywhere to be detected in this scene. My photograph dates from 2005, when the Norwegian artist Lars Romberg had temporarily installed the sign Zweifel, German for doubt, in the letters of the former East German railroad network onto the Palace of the Republic, itself demolished 4 years later to make way for the recreation of the palace, demolished in 1951, but now under reconstruction, bewilderingly enough, in the center of Berlin. But this is perhaps to polemicize and divert from my subject, the origins of display, not the contemporary problem of simulacra, but we might argue whether or not they are connected. De Vailly especially liked to use the Salon to unveil his great projects of urbanism. In the 1789 Salon, and I should point out immediately that this was held in the spring, so we're before the 14th of July, 1789, he had an impressive ensemble of drawings of a comprehensive plan for the urban renewal of Paris. This is an unsolicited drawing for everything that needs to be done, from laying out new quarters to creating an ideal prison on an island, to opening up of the Louvre, to all sorts of projects, the uniting of the two islands for better flow and the creation of new monumental possibilities there, a kind of comprehensive vision of the architect who could rewrite the very fabric of the city, put on public display for public debate. This presaged the rapid expansion of the architectural exhibition as a form of public debate under the French Revolution. In 1793, an architecture section was created finally at the Salon, mirroring now the free market conditions that had prevailed for half a century in English cities. Now, at first, the Parisian exhibitors were dominated by de Vailly and his pupils, and this, I think, too, is fascinating, that in the history of architectural exhibitions, you get sort of masters and pupils who develop very recognizable not only architectural tactics, but tactics also of display. And this we find already in the 18th century, when it is de Vailly's pupils who knew how to get themselves on display, and whose architectural style of drawing and rendering became a dominant one for the ability to get projects into the public discussion. And so there is the Salon of 1789 as envisioned by de Vailly, who proposes to remodel the very space of the Salon, and there again his project. 1794 to 95 was a key year in Paris. For in that year, two new functions of the exhibition worked in tandem with the unfolding project of the revolution to remake both the spaces of public life and the consciousness of the citizen, the citoyen. You can only talk about one of them. Here the second is evoked. Those two events were the competitions of the year two that I want to talk to you about briefly, and then what will form the next chapter of this research on the use of the exhibition for the curating of history, the foundation of the Museum of French Monuments, the Musée des Monuments Français. So in a sense, 1794 to 5, both past and future were to be taken into the public arena and debate. In the same year, a vast plan for restructuring the city, the so-called Plan des Artistes, the artist's plan, was put on display, having taken up and reworked de Vailly's plan first exhibited earlier, just on the eve of the revolution. But for now, it is important, this is a very important set of images. I can't go into them in detail here, but this is, for those of you who hear people talking about they're going to curate a volume, I curated a meal, I've curated my vacation itinerary. This is the birth of the word curating. And this is the first person ever to think of himself as a curator, one of my heroes. You can see a hero of the French Revolution. This is Alexandre Lenoir, who has two guises. And he defines the curator as, in the British sense, a keeper, somebody who is protecting these precious works of art that the revolutionaries might have taken out of palaces and churches that were confiscated by the revolution as public property, and taking them to his museum for safekeeping, the curator as keeper. But I'm very interested in this vision, the flip side, the curator as activist. Here is Lenoir trying to convince the sans-culottes that this tomb is a masterwork of French talent and of history, and not the burial place of a despot of the past. And trying, therefore, what's going to happen there, to change the cultural meaning of these objects into a new discourse, one of the fundamental activities of the curator. But I think we can also say, in his view, that from the birth of the word curator, the curator had the potential to be an activist. But for now, it is important for us to consider the role of the competitions of the year two. You might wonder what the year two is all about. The French Revolution, like so many revolutions, proposed to restart time with its own advent. And so they began renumbering years. In 1793 was the year one. This lasted for about 10 years until people, they also made the week. The problem was they made the week 10 days long, so that Sundays and the day of rest arrived only once every 10 days, and that, I think, was the downfall of this system. But therefore, competitions of the year two correspond to 1794. But they also correspond to this notion of newness, of beginning again. And the competition asks for nothing less than to design the architecture of a future society, as well as the iconography in painting and sculpture that might give identity to a society inventing itself. In painting and sculpture, a whole new dimension of public iconography was called for. But in architecture, though there was absolutely no money, or for that matter, political stability for building, a veritable encyclopedia of new building types was created within a matter of months that would have ramifications for French building for decades to come. From practical markets and tribunals of justice to monuments to the new rituals that were meant to create the emotional and psychic infrastructure of the First French Republic. The results were not published, but rather displayed in a great public exhibition accompanied by a catalog. So arguably one of the first purpose-made catalogs rather than a hand list of an architectural exhibition. I especially like this exhibition not only for its historical import, but because there were 127 paintings on display, 110 proposals for sculpture, and 195 for buildings. For the first time ever, and for a long time to come, architecture dominated a public display of the arts. The exhibition, moreover, was not one of either existing buildings or buildings under construction, but rather the projection of a future architecture for a future state. The exhibition becoming an integral part, then, of the revolutionary project itself, something to be reborn in nearly every major political realignment, notably in the decades following the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Cuban Revolution of '59, or the reunification of Germany in 1989. The government called on painters. I don't think we need to go into what the painters were going to do, but here are some of the projects. Of course, rebuilding the Louvre. Here, a recasting of the center of Lille as a plaza for public address. Here, a temple to equality by the architect Doron. Projects for unveiled as well in relationship to new public festivals. And this, in a certain sense, following on the tradition of Étienne Louis Boullé, who had created what he called a paper museum of architecture. And it was in memory, in a certain sense, of Boulé's great drawings and his idea that they might create a museum of a future architecture, that it was proposed that all of these projects be gathered together to create the foundations not only of a museum of French monuments of the past, but a future working museum, a point of departure for an architecture of the future. A lot of work was done on these, not coincidentally, in 1989, when François Mitterrand was again launching public competitions to redefine his moment at the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. And at that point, the list of the authors of these projects was found, and a whole new phase of research into them. So by the end of 1794, a veritable museum of modern architectural types had been put on display, judged and awarded prizes, and submitted to public scrutiny and extensive discussion in the burgeoning press and broadsides. Projects ranged from the most elevated tasks, a new kind of National Assembly, a temple of laws, a veritable prototype for so many 19th century courthouses, a project we've just seen a moment ago here for a National Singing Academy, essentially Disney Hall, or a National Music Hall by one Bernard, as well as the astounding projects of the young Percier and Fontaine partnership that were to become one of the dominant architectural voices of the next decade. Numerous architectural innovations took place here as well, from the quest for architecture that could speak through a more abstract language of form, the stripping down of the classical language, rather than the deployment of the literal classical orders of architecture, and most famously here in Doron and Thibault's Temple of Equality, of the use of writing and inscriptions. Perhaps here, in this forerunner to La Brouste, Percier and Fontaine's monument to the defenders of the Republic. I could go on and on. There's a building that will take the Constitution and depict it as part of the building. Interestingly, parallel to one of the most extraordinary proposals of the period by that great cultural theorist, the Abbé Grégoire, who not only proposed a standardized French, but proposed that in order to achieve it, a museum of regional dialects should be created. The temporary display of a veritable new Republican typology of public architecture was to be made an instrument for reference in architectural training just a few years later when Doron published his great elephant folio on the collection of buildings of all types, which would serve into the 20th century as the kind of architectural graphic standards for typology. The exhibition was now firmly established within the economy of the circulation of architectural images and types, as well as within the politics of public debate about buildings, their forms, their placements, and their language. The competitions of 1794 did not go unnoticed outside Republican France. In 1796, a high point was reached in the royal capital of Prussia, with the so-called competition of 1796 for a monument to Frederick the Great, of which the most famous project is this one on the screen. Sorry for the dreary black and white image of this spectacular colored design by Friedrich Keesler. This was, as we know from the most recent research, in fact not an open competition at all, but rather an event staged by the architect Karl Gotthard Langhans, best known as the architect of the Brandenburg Gate, in order to try to force the hand of the king. All of the leading figures of the Berlin School presented themselves. In fact, what is interesting is that it was the exhibition of the results that led to the discussion of a Berlin School. So here we have emerging already the idea of an exhibition that defines a school. We don't need to wait for 1932, the international style, nor, from that matter, what we heard about last night at the A&D Gallery, the Los Angeles 10, the role of exhibitions in identifying a group, whether true or fictive, that takes on a staying power and an effective power. This, too, has its origins in the 18th century. Now, while it did not immediately lead to the execution of the project, that would take another 40 years, this drawing did determine a young 18-year-old to abandon his studies of music in favor of architecture. that being Carl Friedrich Schinkel, who later told his first biographer, who was creating a biography to serve as the guide to the Schinkel Museum, the first ever monographic museum of an architect, that he became an architect on the power of this drawing, which he made him convinced that architecture had the capacity to embody the highest values of a society and to promote the greatest amount of change. Now, Schinkel would complete his studies in this building, the architecture school, before the studios and collections while the studios and collections were being housed in the upper floors of this building by Heinrich Genz. This, too, interesting, is a building that circulated in exhibition, in painting, in engraving, and in drawings, and even in a model, which you see here, before it was complete, gave rise to an absolutely lively public debate on the proper form of a modern utilitarian building in the city, gave rise to a debate over the style that the building was in, to which the architect felt compelled to pen a letter to the editor saying that he didn't care what style the public thought it was. The fact that they were debating it was sufficient enough to prove that he had inspired the type of thinking and inquiry that the building was meant to engender. So here then, the exhibition as a way of promoting not only an exhibition, a discussion of what should happen, but a discussion of an entire range of possibilities. Fascinatingly then, this model was placed at the center of the school, where a model display culminated in the building of the school itself on display. Now, were there more time, and because I do want to get to the issue of the avant-garde in closing, were there more time, we would want to follow this new possibility through the decades and even to the present. And indeed, in the research I'm doing, each new technology is followed from origin to current use. This idea of the exhibition as invoking public debate, public exchange, is a possibility for architecture that would take us through a number of key incidents in the history of architecture. Indeed, it is fascinating how many seminal incidents are related to the technology of exhibition. For instance, the insistence in the competition entries for rebuilding the British Houses of Parliament after a devastating fire swept the historic Palace of Westminster in October 1834, that the alternatives proposed by architects should be put on public display. And this is a demand that spread quickly to the daily press, well beyond the professional press. The Houses of Parliament competition has long been seen as a threshold in the emerging 19th century battle of the styles, with the association of medieval and Elizabethan styling as expressive of Englishness and of the great parliamentary tradition of government, in opposition to the then dominant neoclassicism of expression in British public building. It's also been seen as a linchpin in the history of the use of the architectural competition as a democratic way of soliciting building designs for public architecture. But it is equally important in the extension of that democratic claim to the public exhibition of architectural drawings and their role in engendering needed public debate. Writing under his pseudonym Candidus, the pioneering British architectural publisher and journalist John Claudius Loudon, in the lively pages of the architectural magazine, penned the first of what are literally scores of columns that would follow the Houses of Parliament affair under the title A Word on the Rebuilding of the Houses of Parliament. While parliamentary officials, he writes, have given in to the demand for display of the leading contenders, Loudon wants all entries to be put on a public viewing. We cannot see the wisdom of limiting to men of the profession, because if this principle were adopted and acted on generally, it would exclude all the rising talent and all extra-professional talent. If there is to be an exhibition of the designs, what have the leading men of the profession to fear from the designs of those who are not leading men? And in fact, almost every debate about the profession, about schooling, about the rise of talent, about lay versus professional expertise would come to the fore in a 3-year debate that finally resulted in these designs being put on display in the as yet unfinished National Gallery on Trafalgar Square. So fascinatingly, even today's director of the National Gallery, I don't think, is aware of the fact that the first exhibition ever held in the National Gallery was an architecture exhibition. This would soon become common practice in 19th century Britain, the heyday of the use of the competition as a referendum mechanism on design. We could trace it down to 1 decade ago, when the demand of the citizens of New York after 9/11 that a competition be held for the redevelopment of Ground Zero, the projects put on display, and a referendum taken within the exhibition itself was finally met with the impromptu organization of such an exhibition near the site of those tragic events. Now, like so much else about that tragic event and the hope for civic engagement, there's the only image I could find of the exhibition. I visited it, but I was not thinking enough to photograph it at the time. Like so much else about that tragic event and the hope for civic engagement that briefly followed, it is at once something that seems entirely of our own young 21st century, but, as I hope I've shown you, which belongs to the longer trajectory of the history of the architectural exhibition. Now, if you'll bear with me for a few more minutes, I want to bring us more closely to our own time and more closely to my own professional address. Now, the heroic generation of avant-garde architects who emerged in the 1920s and were celebrated in 1932 in this, on the screen, the inaugural exhibition of the world's first permanent department of architecture in a museum, the Museum of Modern Art's so-called international style show, had all, in a sense, invented themselves through the culture of exhibition. So nobody in this display was a foreigner to the idea of displaying their work. While this was a culture long in the making, it was one that gained vital new impulses from emulating the artistic avant-garde in the use of the gallery as a form of experiential manifesto, and from the radical reconceptualization of the role of the artist and architect, notably in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. Now, if the official portraits, like the one on the screen here, of architects at the end of the 19th century, for example, here in this portrait of H.H. Richardson, often depicted the architect as a man of learning in his studio or often seated among books and works of art. So there's no architectural design really anywhere to be discovered in this monumental portrait of H.H. Richardson. It is striking how many of the major figures of the 20th century pose in front of a defining work of their own design made public through exhibition. As here, Walter Gropius standing before the rendering of his competition proposal for the Chicago Tribune Tower, exhibited, as we'll see in a moment, twice, once in Chicago and once in Weimar, or on the right, Mies van der Rohe's most frequently circulated portrait in the 1930s is the one that catches him before his pavilion at the 1929 Barcelona World's Fair, one of the most influential spatial creations of the 20th century, even if it was demolished after only 7 months' existence, and exercised its enormous impact as much through photographs, black and white it should be mentioned, published and exhibited, notably at MOMA in 1932. And of course not these photographs, which were only really unveiled a few years ago. This building was seen by very few of the people for whom it was uncontestably a canonic expression of the capacity of architecture to create a whole new sensation of space, open, flowing, and shifting, through the free plan and the use of freestanding walls that channel rather than enclose space, even if these rarely used photographs tell us a much more complicated story of a building interacting with its academic setting. I like these very much because they remind us what the people who have recreated the pavilion aren't so interested in, that the building could only be photographed and reached through a set of ionic columns that were standing there. And in fact, this whole building is in many ways interacting with that, as much as it's both negating it and shifting it in extremely interesting ways. You can make them out again here in this aerial view of the Barcelona pavilion. Mies, alternatively, in some photographs, airbrushes their shadows out or leaves them. There we go. No less was the architect as the prefigurer of a new society with wholly new spatial concepts epitomized in one of the opening architectural acts of the Soviet Revolution. The commission here to Vladimir Tatlin in 1919 to design a monument to the Third International, a radical open spiral meant to rewrite the Eiffel Tower in new socialist terms. So if the Eiffel Tower is 300 meters tall, the Third International is 400 meters tall. It was exhibited first in the streets on the left upon completion of the model. As with agitprop trains and street festivals, the new Soviet artists broke the boundaries between art and life, between the gallery and the street, seeking an art which could be the transformation of daily experience. Put on display subsequently on the right in a Petrograd gallery in November 1920, Tatlin's tower with its 3 primary forms rotating at different rates to house a great hall of assembly, an administrative center, and a propaganda or newscasting machine, was reassembled the next month in Moscow for the 8th Soviet Congress. Mayakovsky dubbed it immediately the first object of October, the first to truly express the principles of the revolution. He called it as well our first monument without a beard. Inspired by the new ethos in Berlin, the Arbeitsrat für Kunst, the Work Council for the Arts, was founded in March 1919, primarily as an organization for organizing exhibitions outside official venues. As founding member Walter Gropius explained, quote, to create a new guild of craftsmen without the class distinctions which raise an arrogant barrier between craftsman and artist. A statement from that exhibition reworked later that year into the foundation manifesto of the Bauhaus School. In April 1919, you see it here, the group's first exhibition at Neumann's Gallery in Berlin, Ausstellung für unbekannte Architekten, exhibition of unknown architects, was a demonstration of the idea that artistic expressionism could also find itself, an architectural expression, capable of projecting buildings whose primary goal was to serve as instruments for emotions, sentiments, and ideals, not only individual but communal experiences that could serve to rebuild community spirit for a defeated Germany. The exhibition circulated for over a year, first to the Art Museum in Weimar, where it was on view in the summer of 1919 as Gropius opened the Bauhaus, and much as the futurist exhibitions before the war here in Petrograd or in Milan had, where the last futurist exhibition of December 1915 to January 1916 led to the famous split between Malevich and Tatlin, so too the exhibition of unknown architects created a sense of an exciting wave of artistic unity, vibrant if fragile. Now, even those who were excluded were transformed by that exhibition in Berlin of unknown architects. The young Ludwig Mies, that's his birth name, it's a terrible name, it translates basically as Louis Lousy, Mies means measly or lousy. You can understand why he changed it, but you're going to see the circumstances that led to him to change his name. The young Ludwig Mies submitted this beautiful gouache rendering of the project he had been at work on just before the war, a great villa for the Kroller-Müller family in Holland to house not only the family, but their art collections. The project was rejected as non-progressive formalism. Mies responded violently. Within months, he changed not only his direction, but his name, adopting for his future submissions the name Mies van der Rohe, and submitting henceforth a series of projects unanchored from commissions and clients, projects that declared the exhibition as the true ground for inventing an architecture of the moment and the future. 2 years later, he made a spectacular entry into the discourse of ideas and images that made Berlin galleries and periodicals a focal point of the European architectural debate, even as the fragile economy of the young Weimar Republic made commissions few and far between. 2 entirely glazed towers appeared that year in the Great Berlin Art Exhibition, including one reworking an earlier proposal in response to the open competition for proposals for Berlin's first skyscraper. If you're following the papers, there's a huge controversy now over a new skyscraper in Berlin, Frank Gehry's winning proposal for Alexanderplatz. But this is the first catalyst of the Berlin skyscraper debate, Mies's project for Friedrichstrasse. The 35-year-old Mies, who had designed nothing but a few private houses in the handful of years since he left Peter Barron's office, made a bid to engage in the raging debate on the form of the post-war metropolis and the introduction of the American skyscraper to German cities. A monument clad entirely in the anti-heroic material of glass, Mies continued for months after the competition was closed to refine the imagery of this complex but immediately graspable volume, whose faceted surfaces of uninterrupted glass would oscillate between effects of transparency and reflection. For exhibition, he worked the design up into this drawing, which you probably know, frequently on display at MOMA, as often as I can allow it out in the light, into these grand-scaled perspective drawings. That's not that much smaller in reality than it is on the screen, the kind of drawing that you can walk into, 1.8 meters high. Officially, Mies was rejected by the jury, made up largely of business leaders, with a single architect, despite the fact that he had provided many times the amount of floor space for offices than any other entry in the competition. These 2 rejections, first by Gropius, then by the skyscraper debate, set the stage for an intense period over the next few years that would result in a series of manifesto projects on the full palette of modern building materials. A second glass skyscraper, 1922, a concrete office country house, 1923, There again, a concrete office building, 1923, and finally a brick country house in 1924. If Mies had been shunned by Gropius in 1919, he was in fact to be given pride of place here in the first Bauhaus exhibition of modern architecture called International Architecture, and actually the forerunner of the exhibition at MoMA. I could go on and on to demonstrate for you how nearly every great architect of the interwar years first emerged in the 20s as an exhibition architect. Of course, Corbusier, with his towers exhibited in 1922 and again in 1923. This is just an example of all of the architecture exhibitions that one could visit in Europe in 1922. In spring, the De Verstaeg group in Prague included an exhibition for young architects, and this is a little bit out of place. Frank Lloyd Wright exhibiting, and Catherine Smith, who's here in the audience, is working on a book on these hundreds of exhibitions. In fact, there were very few years in his life when he did not organize or participate in an exhibition, beginning at least in his displays around 1907. So that Wright, too, an exhibitionary architect. Indeed, the Art Institute of Chicago, which would not open an architecture department per se until the mid-1970s, was a regular venue for architectural displays, most notably the exhibition in May 1923 of 123 of the works submitted to the international competition for the Chicago Tribune Tower. And venues proliferated. Perhaps the most innovative was the Bauhaus exhibition of 1923, in which Gropius defined at least three technologies of exhibition. One, a transformation of an existing building through its complete repainting and recasting by the students, this project for the staircase. The redesign of his own office as a model of a modern interior and a Gesamtkunstwerk, and the exhibition of these radical axonometric sections of it. The exhibition of a full-scale house of a modern dwelling, something that actually goes back to the mid-19th century with the invention of the housing exhibition, complete with new types of furniture. This is the incredible children's building block furniture designed by the woman architect Alma Siedler-Buschhoff, later acquired by Nicholas Pevsner and used for his children for generations, and related clearly to the building block system that Gropius showed in this exhibition, International Architecture, including that and this famous red cube house, all brought together some 6 years before the Museum of Modern Art. Likewise, another technology emerging, this is the De Stael group show that defines De Stael, Mies interestingly part of it, but perhaps one of the most innovative and one of the first really to think of himself also as an exhibition designer, Friedrich Keesler, a member of the De Stael group who had exhibited there at the 1923 Paris exhibition, but who would write of this installation, the Vienna Exhibition of New Theater Techniques. He says, "It was in 1924, in the Vienna of Strauss's waltzes and in the Paris of the Beaux-Arts, that I eliminated the separation between floors, walls, and ceilings, and created floors, walls, and ceilings as a continuous whole." So a completely new spatial paradigm emerging from the techniques of exhibition. At first, this apparatus that was movable and interactive and allowed one to flip drawings and find things behind, a kind of incredible display apparatus here in Vienna, was displayed 1 year later on the right as a city in space, an exhibition in which all secondary content was removed and the installation apparatus itself became the exhibition to which this evocative and provocative title of City in Space, there you see it, was applied. So unlike the centuries of seeking an ideal setting for unique views of objects on display, Keesler created an armature that was itself a kind of endless architecture, as well as a mechanism for exposing every object on exhibit to multiple viewpoints and changing juxtapositions. The notion that an exhibition was not a narrative, but a spatial experience, a place of multiplicity, indeterminacy, and participation, went hand in hand with the spatial experiments of the avant-garde itself. Keesler, moreover, designed all the publicity apparatus, the poster, the catalog, the admission ticket, and the stationery for organizing the exhibition. For Paris, Keesler was invited by Joseph Hoffmann to create this City in Space, celebrated by Theodor von Doesburg. "You have realized that which we dreamed could one day be accomplished," von Doesburg quipped. Even a decade after its demolition, it was celebrated still by art historians, notably by Alfred Barr. It's the exhibition. Here's Barr. By then, Barr had penned the comment with which we must end before one brief coda. And this was the claim that accompanied the catalog that proposed a department of architecture in the new Museum of Modern Art. Barr had laid out, inspired by the Bauhaus Museum, they could have departments almost thought impossible: a department of film, a department of photography, a department of industrial design, and a department of architecture. And he wrote to try to explain to the trustees why such a department should be created. Exhibitions and expositions have perhaps changed the character of architecture of the last 40 years more than any other factor, Alfred Barr wrote, and then reiterating that in the catalog for the first permanent architectural exhibition created in this new institution, Modern Architecture International Exhibition. Interestingly, in many ways, the culmination of a long period, as well as attempting to be the origins of something new. So I just want to add in a quota. I would like, and the hour is late, to have done a lot of advertising for my own work as a curator. Instead, I wanted to show you that much of the inspiration comes from farming, this long history and the many palettes of technique. Prime among them, I suppose, is to respond in some ways to my notion of the curator as advocate, the curator as particularly as activist, as we already saw in the moment of the French Revolution. And I just end with the reminder of two shows that perhaps you know of or may have even seen, occupying the small 50 by 50 foot architecture gallery at the Museum of Modern Art. Here on the left, Rising Currents, an exhibition that put on display work that did not exist at the time the exhibition itself was created, in which I invited 5 interdisciplinary teams to imagine redesigning parts of New York in the face of rising sea levels and more frequent storm activity with climate change, and then a nationwide exploration of the first ring of a sprawl, sometimes the second ring, in which 5 architectural teams and other interdisciplinary designers gathered to look at 5 troubled suburban sites, I think well known to many of you here, because faculty member Andrew Zago participated in that exhibition, Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream. So even though these were very much vaunted as new types of exhibitions and new approaches to using MoMA as a platform for the as yet not thought, it seems to me they fall into a very, very long tradition of the architectural exhibition, as I hope I've shown you in my rather long-winded excavations of its genealogy, not as a reflection of what architecture does in the real world, but as something in many, many different guises which has never stopped to create possibilities for the practice and the discipline and the public debate of architecture. Thank you very much for your patience.